The collapse did not happen all at once. It unfolded like a slow, suffocating storm, calculated, deliberate, and deeply personal. Victor Newman did not believe in chaos, he believed in control. And control, to him, meant breaking a person not just externally, but internally, until they began to doubt their own instincts. Phyllis Summers had always prided herself on being unbreakable, on surviving situations that would have crushed anyone else. But this time, the ground beneath her was shifting in ways she could not predict. And that uncertainty gnawed at her more viciously than any direct attack. It began with silence. Employees who once filled her office with noise, ambition, and loyalty started disappearing one by one. At first, it seemed like coincidence, better offers, personal decisions, life changes. But patterns emerged too quickly to ignore. Entire departments vanished within days, key personnel leaving without warning. Their resignations delivered with rehearsed neutrality that betrayed something deeper beneath the surface. Phyllis understood then that this was not coincidence. It was orchestration. Victor had always known where to strike. He did not simply dismantle her company, he dismantled her belief in the people she had trusted. Each departure was not just a loss of manpower, it was a quiet accusation, a whisper that perhaps she had misjudged everyone around her. That perhaps loyalty had always been an illusion. And that thought lingered longer than she wanted it to. Victoria's role was different, but no less destructive. Where Victor moved like a shadow, Victoria moved like a blade, sharp, visible, and precise. She did not hide her contempt. Every calculated move she made carried an undercurrent of personal satisfaction, as if dismantling Phyllis was not just business, but something far more intimate. Her pressure was relentless, her presence unavoidable, and her timing impeccable. She appeared at the exact moments when Phyllis was most vulnerable, reinforcing the sense that there was no space left untouched. No moment left unobserved. Phyllis fought back in the only way she knew how, by refusing to yield. Outwardly, she maintained composure, projecting defiance even as her world unraveled. But internally, the cracks had begun to form. The loss of her company was one thing, the erosion of her certainty was another. She had always relied on her instincts, on her ability to read people and anticipate moves. Now, those instincts felt unreliable, as if the rules of the game had been rewritten without her knowledge. The introduction of the AI-generated evidence marked a turning point. It was not just a strategic escalation, it was psychological warfare at its most insidious. Victor understood that truth was no longer the most powerful weapon, perception was. The evidence did not need to be real, it only needed to be believable. And in a world increasingly shaped by technology, the line between truth and fabrication had become dangerously thin. When Phyllis first learned of it, her reaction was not fear, but anger, sharp, immediate, and consuming. But beneath that anger lay something more unsettling, doubt. Not doubt in her innocence, but in her ability to prove it. The realization that she could be destroyed by something entirely fabricated shook her in ways she had not anticipated. It was no longer a matter of defending herself against accusations. It was a battle against a narrative that could be constructed and manipulated at will. Victor's motivation was not simply to win. It was to remind Phyllis of her place in a hierarchy he believed was immutable. To him, she was a variable that had grown too unpredictable, too bold. And unpredictability was a threat he could not tolerate. By dismantling her piece by piece, he was not just eliminating a rival, he was restoring what he saw as order. Victoria's motivation, however, was more complicated. Beneath her calculated exterior lay a tangle of unresolved emotions, resentment, ambition, and a deep-seated need for validation. Taking down Phyllis was, in many ways, a demonstration of her own strength, a way to prove that she could not only stand beside her father, but rival him in precision and ruthlessness. Yet there were moments, fleeting and unwelcome, where hesitation crept in. Not out of sympathy, but out of recognition. She saw in Phyllis a reflection of what she herself had become: relentless, unyielding, and dangerously isolated. Phyllis, meanwhile, found herself at a crossroads she had never faced before. Her usual strategies, manipulation, counterattacks, calculated risks, felt insufficient against an opponent who controlled not just the playing field, but the rules themselves. The temptation to retaliate with equal ruthlessness grew stronger with each passing day. She began to consider actions she would have once dismissed, lines she had sworn she would not cross again. That internal conflict became her greatest battle. On one side was the part of her that refused to be broken, that demanded retaliation at any cost. On the other was the awareness that descending further into that darkness could destroy what little remained of her stability. The more she resisted, the more the pressure intensified, pushing her closer to a breaking point she could no longer clearly define. As the walls closed in, the external world began to mirror her internal turmoil. Legal threats mounted, financial resources dwindled, and alliances that once seemed secure began to falter. Every move she made was anticipated, countered, and neutralized with unnerving precision. It was as if she were playing a game where every outcome had already been decided. And yet, despite everything, she did not surrender. That refusal was not born of hope, but of defiance. If she was going to fall, it would not be quietly. It would not be on their terms. The anger that had once threatened to consume her began to transform into something sharper, more focused. Not a loss of control, but a different kind of control, one rooted in the acceptance that there was nothing left to lose. Victor watched this transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. He had expected resistance, but not this particular kind. There was a difference between desperation and calculated recklessness, and Phyllis was beginning to embody the latter. That made her dangerous in a way that even he could not fully predict. Victoria sensed it too. The dynamic had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Phyllis was no longer reacting, she was preparing. For what, neither of them could say. But the uncertainty introduced a new variable into a situation that had once seemed entirely under control. In the end, the battle was no longer just about power, or business, or even revenge. It had become something far more volatile, a collision of wills, driven by pride, fear, and the unwillingness to be defined by defeat. Each of them stood on the edge of decisions that could not be undone, choices that would reshape not only the outcome of this conflict, but the very nature of who they were. And in that space, where certainty dissolved and consequences loomed, the true cost of their actions began to emerge, not as a distant possibility, but as an inevitable reckoning waiting just beyond the next move. The final unraveling came not with an explosion, but with a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. The room where everything converged was cold, stripped of distraction, leaving nowhere for anyone to hide from each other, or from themselves. By then, the narrative Victor had so carefully constructed was already in motion, spreading through channels that no one could fully contain. The AI-generated evidence had done exactly what it was designed to do: distort, convince, and condemn. Phyllis was no longer fighting accusations, she was fighting a reality that had already been accepted by everyone else. But something shifted in those final moments. Not in Victor, whose composure remained unshaken, nor in Victoria, whose focus never wavered, but in Phyllis. The anger that had driven her began to recede, replaced by a chilling clarity. It was the kind of calm that only came when fear had nowhere left to grow. And in that clarity, she made a decision that neither Victor nor Victoria had anticipated. What surfaced next did not just challenge the evidence, it redefined the entire battlefield. Hidden layers of data, fragments of truth buried beneath Victor's own manipulation, began to emerge in a way that could not be easily dismissed. But the revelation came at a cost. In exposing the flaw, Phyllis also exposed herself, choices she had made, risks she had taken, lines she had crossed long before this war began. The distinction between victim and architect blurred in an instant. For the first time, Victor's control faltered. Not visibly, not in a way most would notice, but enough. Enough for Victoria to see it, enough for doubt to flicker where certainty had once lived. Because this was no longer a clean victory. It was a fracture. And then came the final twist, the one no one had prepared for. The system Victor trusted, the very AI he had weaponized, turned unpredictable under the weight of conflicting data. Its conclusions began to contradict themselves, unraveling the narrative it had been built to enforce. In seconds, the foundation of his accusation collapsed into ambiguity. Not innocence. Not guilt. Something far more dangerous, uncertainty. Phyllis stood at the center of it, not vindicated, not destroyed, something far worse for her enemies. Uncontainable. The aftermath was not triumph. It was disarray. Reputations were no longer weapons, they were liabilities. Alliances cracked under pressure. And for the first time, Victor Newman was not dealing with a defeated opponent, but with a consequence he could not fully control. In the end, no one walked away clean. Because the truth had not been revealed, it had been fractured. And in those fractures, something far more volatile took shape, a war no longer defined by power, but by the irreversible damage each of them had inflicted on the other, and on themselves.